My name is Chris Pockney. I'm an ecologist with Biolinks Alliance, and I'm going to kick us off tonight. So I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from Taungurung country and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Extend that respects to all of the First Nations people across Central Victoria, where Biolinks Alliance work, and to any First Nations people in the audience tonight. Tonight's meeting is being recorded, so please do remember to keep yourself muted and keep your videos off to help with that. And tonight we're going to hear all about our experience working with the Upper Deep Creek Landcare Network, Melbourne Water and Macedon Ranges Shire Council around how to build a biolink. So the project that we're calling the Deep Creek Biolink, happening on obviously a stretch of the Deep Creek around Lancefield and Romsey. And we're lucky enough to have two of the really key people involved with that process presenting to you all here tonight. So we've got Cameron O'Mara, who is Biolinks Alliance Landscape Project Coordinator, I believe, Cam. Cam can correct me when he starts if I've got his title wrong. And we have Carl Nee, who's President of the Newman District Landcare, and also a Biolinks Alliance board member. So I won't hold us up too much longer. Let's get into it, and I'll hand over to you, Cam and Carl.
Thanks, Chris. So at Newham Landcare, we've been working on the Cobar Biolink for around 20 years, and it's at the headwaters of the Campaspe and Maribyrnong rivers and links the Cobar and Mount Macedon forests. It's also a priority area in the Macedon Ranges biodiversity strategy and includes the start of two priority waterway biolinks, both Deep Creek and Campaspe. So next slide, please, Cam. We've been working with Melbourne Water on improving the riparian corridors, but even after 20 years, we still have sections on Deep Creek, which looks like this. Next slide. So the key question is really, how do we change from something like that to, next slide, to this? This is a photo of Deep Creek just a bit further upstream at its confluence with Garden Hut Creek. It's actually on our property, and the beauty of the creek was a major attraction in us buying the land. We've been doing water quality sampling here, and Melbourne Water has held macroinvertebrate training days here as well. In fact, it's been said that Garden Hut Creek can set the benchmark for what the water quality of the Maribyrnong River downstream could become. Next slide, please, Cam. Biolinks Alliance held a rewilding forum a few years ago in Kyneton, and a key question from the audience was, how can we get the significant changes that we need? There was full agreement that we need collaboration from all walks of life, and we need to think bigger, bolder, and stronger. Next slide, thanks. So I guess the first step is to think big and create a common vision. That led us to the idea of a Melbourne to Echuca biolink along the Maribyrnong, up the Great Divide and down the Campaspe River catchments. But let's start smaller and develop confidence in the process and progress a pilot to demonstrate what can be achieved. Next slide, Cam. This is a map of the headwaters of Deep Creek and the location of recorded vulnerable species along the waterway. You've got a threatened breeding population of koalas isolated at Hanging Rock. There are brush-tailed phascogales and powerful owls further downstream. There's endangered Yarra pygmy perch north of Lancefield, and you've got platypus sightings at Romsey near the Greater Western Water Treatment Plant. This would be a good place to start and develop a pilot program. Next slide, thanks. So what are the key hurdles? Typically, with a lot of groups, there are fragmented objectives and limited communication. Access to land and landholder reluctance is probably our biggest hurdle. Then there's obviously funding and resources. Next slide. So to be successful, these are some of the key needs that the various organizations sort of working on this common goal would need. We need a sort of common vision and objectives, a toolkit for action, for us action groups, communication tools, mapping, and we need targeted landholder engagement. Next slide. So that's the basis of this pilot program, which is a collaboration between Biolinks Alliance, Upper Deep Creek Landcare Network, Macedon Ranges Shire Council, and Melbourne Water. On the map there on the left, you can see where it sits between Melbourne and Echuca. Over to you, Cam.
Great, thanks, Carl. So Chris has just popped in the chat. If you have any questions that you think of throughout, please just pop them in the chat as we go, and then Chris will read them out at the end. So yeah, Carl, thanks for that. It was a great explanation of the sort of the foundation of the project and why it came about. I'm going to be talking more about our involvement and where we come into the picture. So basically, Melbourne Water are funding this project, and we've been approached by Upper Deep Creek to sort of help change the way that we're engaging these landholders to try and understand better how we do it in a more effective way. So how we approach the landholders in a way that actually gets them involved in the project, because that has been the hardest thing to do over the life of the project. So Melbourne Water have handed out a lot of funding to landholders along Deep Creek over the years, with some success in some areas and many landholders just being an outright no. So what they've ended up with is these huge gaps along the creek where no work has been done at all, and then some areas where lots of work has been done. So yeah, that's where we come in to try and change the way that we're communicating and managing with these landholders to try and get more support in the community. So the way we went about that first was we came up with a plan for the plan, basically, which is an implementation plan. And there's just a rough outline of the whole length of the project and how long it actually takes to get this stuff off the ground. So it's a 2-year project. So through that planning process, we came up with a series of proposals for areas that a biolink could exist based on the existing habitat, the existing landholders in those zones, and how much we could target for a pilot over the course of a 2-year project. So this is about trying to investigate you know, where in the landscape we could actually achieve these things, and yeah, going from there, what can we do with those landholders, basically. So we came up with these 5 different zones that you can see there in the different colors, and through consultation with Melbourne Water and the Landcare groups and other stakeholders, we picked the one in the top left-hand corner, which is that one just there. So you've got Lancefield just here, Romsey just down here, you've got the Cobor Ranges up the top, and you've got Mount Macedon down here, Hanging Rock over here, and this is where the Newham Biolink is, and the blue is Deep Creek running all the way through. So the area that we've bounded is sort of the area that we're focused on for the project, sort of the landscape that's relevant to the biolink that we're trying to implement. And all of those borders are the properties that lie within that biolink area. So they're the properties that we're actually targeting and trying to engage with this project. So as Carl mentioned earlier, some of the key issues that we have in the landscape, low landholder participation, a lack of cohesive efforts. A lot of the work that's being done isn't being done in a way that's considerate of the entirety of the landscape and the needs of that landscape. Very fragmented landscapes, a lot of highly disconnected core areas of habitat that don't have many stepping stones between them. A general lack of ecological knowledge among many of the landholders as well. A lot of them want to do well by their property and be good land managers, but a lot of the time they don't know the things that they're doing might not be as beneficial and sometimes maybe detrimental. You know, things like planting inappropriate species, thinking that they're planting the appropriate species and introducing weeds accidentally in that process. Broken hydrology is a very prominent feature of Deep Creek, is these permanent pools of water strung together along the creek. And the hydrology of this landscape has been completely changed by the introduction of huge numbers of dams, and also the extraction of water from the water table has completely changed the way water behaves from how it would have a few hundred years ago in this landscape. So yeah, very, very damaged hydrology in the area, and obviously damaging land management practices. So it's one of the most fertile areas of Greater Melbourne in Victoria, and it's just been farmed very, very heavily for a very long time, and there are huge areas where there's basically no existing indigenous vegetation throughout it. So yeah, quite damaged in many areas. So one of the things that we focused on was getting some iconic species in the landscape, either threatened species or just species that are very recognizable to people, or both. And a lot of these are both. And we tried to pick species that represent a broad suite of different ecological needs, or needs in terms of connectivity in the landscape. So things like platypus obviously are going to have much different requirements for restoration than something like a koala will. So you can kind of group some of them together. We're going to look in more detail at koalas, phascogales, and woodland birds. But things like frogs and fish, obviously they're going to have significantly different requirements. So yeah, there's a lot of really interesting things that can be done when trying to think about how you restore these ecosystems through the lens of each of these species. So this is just a broad sweeping map of the region. Again, same sort of map as we were looking at earlier, just showing you where roughly some of those icon species tend to hang out. And we have a lot more records of where these species have been in the past, but currently these are some of the ones in the region that we know of. So I'm going to jump into now one of the most interesting parts, in my opinion, of this whole project. So one of the things that we decided we were going to do as part of it was connectivity modeling. So the idea of it is you look at the landscape and you use these models to determine where the existing core areas of habitat are in the landscape, and then you use a variety of different inputs to generate a model that identifies where in the landscape those core patches are most likely to be connected. So if you have something like we have here, which is a phascogale and koala priority pathway map, we're looking at what is the minimum patch size that a koala needs, and those areas of dark green are the core areas. So we looked at what's the minimum size that a koala population needs to sustain itself. We determined those based on all of the best available evidence and scientific literature on that topic, and from there we use a tool called Linkage Mapper and a series of inputs that we insert into the model to generate the pathways between those core areas of habitat. So what it basically does at the end of the day is it calculates values for each of those pixels in between those core areas based on the type of landscape that's there already, things like roads, things like waterways, and other things that might be barriers or might make it easier for an animal to pass through, all go into this model, and it calculates where the least cost pathways are. between two areas of core habitat. So you can see that the green represents higher connectivity, and then the red obviously represents basically no connectivity. So the odds of an animal being able to move through that area are almost zero. And what this also does, which is quite interesting, is it allows us to see where our management is best spent, where our dollars are best spent, where our time is best spent. You know, if you're gonna be trying to restore these landscapes at scale, if you're going to be trying to restore for specific species and actually get the connectivity back that will allow them to persist, there's almost no point trying to spend money in the middle of a zone like this, where you may improve an isolated patch of vegetation, but for the purpose of this project, it's just not worth spending our time on it. And we can really focus our efforts on the areas that will have the greatest benefit for the species that we're interested in. So this model was done based on Fascigale, basically, but all of the best known information, you could apply it to koalas as well. I mean, there really isn't that much difference between the movement habits of koalas and things like Fascigales. There might be some slight variations, but yeah, these models aren't granular enough to pick up on those details anyway. So we also did this for woodland birds, which I'm about to flick over to. So keep an eye on the difference and how this changes as I flick across. So you can see there that there's obviously the core patches that are required for woodland birds aren't as large as for Fascigales and koalas. So you do get some variation in the model there once you make those changes. So there's a few areas through here, for instance, where the connectivity increases because there's just more opportunities for woodland birds to persist in those smaller patches. And obviously they can fly, but not as far as you might think a lot of the time. So what went into the model? This is just a very broad overview of the types of things that went into it. There was a lot of back and forth with Chris and myself and all of these algorithms to try and tease out what things will give us a result that's meaningful. And we basically we used a land cover model. So land cover is just a layer, a raster that will show you all of the various different types of land in a given area. So we have these for the whole of Victoria, I think for the whole of Australia even. So by looking at what the different types of vegetation are and correlating that with other models that we have, like forest cover and things like that, we can look at where the types of vegetation are in the landscape and reduce the resistance in those, or derive our core patches from those. So if we were looking at something like native grasses instead of forests, we'd get a different answer to where those core patches are in the landscape. Or if we were looking at wetlands, then yeah, we would be deriving different core patches than the ones that we did for the previous model that I showed you. So we also use things like waterways. So you can see the primary waterway through here. We reduced the resistance based on how significant a waterway there was, understanding that many of the animals would be more likely to use those pathways through the landscape. And obviously, at the same time, we're focused on the creek. The funding is going to be on the creek. Melbourne Water are only funding properties that are directly backing onto Deep Creek frontage. So that's another reason to focus on the creek quite heavily for this project as well. And then we added in things like roads to basically act as a negative indicator for movement values. So a road, a significant road, which is shown in 0 and down through to 4 being, a less active road. So Vic Roads has all of this data available, but basically if a road is more active, it's more likely to be a barrier to a koala or a phascogale due to roadkill or just noise pollution as well is a big deterrent for a lot of wildlife. So yeah, we factor those things into our model as well. So why is it significant? So what I've got here is this is a sort of typical connectivity model that you see. This is in India. So you can see that map there is covering a huge area. So they're trying to look at Indian tiger populations and their connectivity pathways between huge distances. We're talking about hundreds, thousands of kilometers of area that they're looking at connectivity on. And this is really typical of connectivity modeling. They're looking at massive landscapes, often the size of countries or even continents. They're trying to model based on that. And the reason is because the granularity of the data works at those scales really well. But we're actually getting to the point now with the data that's available to us that we can do these things on a much smaller scale. And that's really important because so many of the groups that we work with, they're not working on this scale. They're not working at the government level, the federal funding sort of level. They're working within maybe a few townships, and they're trying to think about what they can do on their property and where the least cost pathways are on their property. So even the maps that we have done, we would like to get them to the point where we're looking at individual waterways on a single property and determining how that is connected to the surrounding landscape and yeah, how that might have implications for the management of each specific property. So yeah, it's one of the key things that we've been trying to do with this project is have some very localized connectivity modeling. So from there, we've engaged a number of landholders through the pilot and done some preliminary property plans for each of them. And we've really tried to make these property plans as tailored for those properties as we possibly can and provide information that is not just very cookie cutter, weed management or restoration, planting guides, things like that. Really in-depth planting guides based on each property and the types of realistic things that can be done with staged planting, which you can see I've sort of talked about there, sort of trying to get the fundamental things back into the landscape before trying to get in some of the more complicated things back into the landscape, focusing on those easier, more pioneer species or the more functional species that really do build the base for everything else before you go and start trying to establish things that you're just going to have mass die-off or you're going to have a lot of lack of success until you actually have those really well-established pioneer species. So other types of interventions that we focus on are instead of just doing things like edge planting along fence lines to try and get wind breaks and things like that, really focusing restoration efforts in a way that will connect areas of core habitat to the creek as a really strong corridor. So all of our recommendations are based on those kinds of things. This area that you can see in blue was one of the recommendations that we gave to a landholder on a bit of steep, relatively unusable land that doesn't get grazed heavily. It's still been cleared. It's cleared land that, some of the areas that are too steep have not been cleared and there's still a bit of existing tree cover on a lot of it. But much of it's been cleared and it's fairly unusable land, agriculturally speaking. So finding those areas where landholders are willing to work with us based on that, that they're not losing any land that they aren't not using anyway, is a real win-win for us. So yeah, trying to find out where they can fit in is a big part of things too. So another thing is there are hundreds and hundreds of dams across these sites. So a lot of the time, people just don't even realize that they could be improving the productivity of their farm and the health of their farm by doing some of these interventions. You're turning a dam from a net carbon emitter to a carbon sink. When you do these kinds of things, reintroducing appropriate marginal wetland species around the edge, creating limited access to dams. The water actually lasts longer, the water is healthier, your livestock's healthier, all of the above. So yeah, there's all of these different things that people could be doing, and it's very simple and it doesn't hurt your bottom line. It actually often helps, which is something that's quite heavily considered for many of these farmers. So we also created an interactive map, which I'll show you here. So a big part of the project was that we need to be able to communicate what we're doing. I hope everyone can see that map that I've just brought up. But basically this map shows you all of the elements of the project. So you've got your catchment area, and you can click through and have a look at all of the different information on each of these as you go. You can look at the riparian vegetation quality. So you see, these areas that are up in the Cobble Ranges, very high, but down here in the middle of Landsfield, very low. So it's all based on vegetation coverage along the creek. And we've got also all of our different threatened species record from the VVA. So you can see all the koala records there. You can see all the golden sun moth records, or the Yarra pygmy perch, fairly isolated, or all the powerful owl sightings over the years. Things like Fascal, where are the Fascals? Fascals are there. So yeah, we've also got, so that's the Deep Creek area that we're focused on. And then we've got all the other Biolink projects, and you can kind of see how we're starting to build on that Melbourne to Echuca. I've got a long way to go, but there's a few Biolinks in the area that are sort of starting to link all of that together. But yeah, a lot of work needs to be done still. And then last, we've managed to get the connectivity modeling in there as well. So you can see those. You can click through on those. It'll tell you some of the detail about what each of the zones mean. And if a landholder, for instance, were to go and look and say this is your property down here, you look and you go, oh, okay, so that part of the creek through there is a very a good zone to be focusing efforts on, or maybe through there, or a little bit further north through there is very high connectivity considered through there. So yeah, there could be implications for any landholder being able to look at this and actually flick around and see what they've got going on. And yeah, like I said, we've also got the woodland bird connectivity up there as well. So all of that's viewable. So that's the interactive map. So one of the other things that we're going to be doing as well, monitoring is obviously a pretty significant part of all of these projects. How do you actually monitor any outcomes that you achieve? So we've put together a bit of a proposal to create these kits for the landcare groups to be able to do things like bird monitoring with using the volunteers in the groups, and eventually using the landholders that become part of the Biolink. They will deploy acoustic monitoring kits, which you can see Chris there installing one at Spring Plains. So that's a bat monitor, but it's also good for monitoring bird life. So if you deploy these, you can set them up so that they're recording for the same amount of time each day. So you've got a lot of control over the methodology that way. So if a landholder goes out, installs one of these for a week, gets them down again, and pulls the SD card out and plugs it into their computer, sends it off to us, or uploads it to this software, which can automatically identify a lot of the birds that we have, and then we can punch all of that into our spreadsheets, determine the most common species, or the different types of the different groupings of species, so things like feeding guilds or behavioral guilds, and look at what those guilds mean for the types of ecosystem needs that are in that area. And we can make some sort of, if we have enough data over a large enough area, we can make some pretty interesting insight. We can get some pretty interesting insights as to how our interventions are going, or whether we're improving, or whether the bird populations are getting less complex over time. So yeah, there's some really interesting things we can do with that. But one of the things we want to do is develop these kits. So people basically get a box that has all of the information that they need in it. They have one of these recorders in there that shows them how to set it up, how to install the software to analyze the data, how to upload the data to a place that we can keep all of it in one spot. Because at the moment, these models that are being used to identify birds, they're useful, but they're not perfect. But they're getting better as time goes on. They're really good for American species, but we don't have enough of the training data yet in Australia for them to be 100% reliable 100% of the time. And you can see the model actually spits out a confidence value on each of those records on the side. So yeah, as long as we've got those raw audio files, we can eventually come back once we have more confidence in these models and reanalyze them to improve our confidence over time. But yeah, I feel like these kits are going to be a really good way to not only get landholders involved and out there doing citizen science, but also get some quite reliable long-term data sets without too much work, because it's a really big thing to undertake all of this monitoring for a project this size, if you don't have a lot of support from volunteers and things like that. So another thing that we'll be doing is a lot of education. So we're going to be going and visiting schools as part of the project and talking about the Biolink and getting kids involved. So this is just a photo from one of our large old tree days from years ago, where we basically go out with the kids, sit down in front of these are yellow boxes, and get the kids to draw them. And just it's all about just getting back into nature and getting your hands dirty and having fun, basically, and hopefully learning something along the way. And we're going to be doing public outreach. So I'll be at the Lancefield Farmers Market this Saturday, talking to people. So handing things out and just having a yarn with whatever landholder wants to come and talk to me. So yeah, we'll be doing a fair bit of that as well. And we'll also be doing a few tours. We'll be holding field days where people can come out and see stretches of the creek on public and private land, and basically talking to people about the creek and the history of the creek and what can be done, having a look at a few example sites where people have done work, and some others where work is going to be done soon, and some others where it's completely degraded, and yeah, everything in between, basically. So if you know anyone who's in the Lancefield area, or you want to start a Biolink yourself, please reach out. We're always interested in this sort of stuff. So yeah, if you know any other projects that could have some cross-pollination as well, or anything where we could share ideas, then yeah, please reach out. That QR code will take you through to the interactive map, I'm pretty sure. But yeah, if anyone has any questions, I'd love to try and answer them.
Awesome. Thanks, Cam. We've got one question in the chat so far from Simon, and yet everyone else, please feel free to whack them in there, and we'll get through them. So I guess, yeah, curious to get your thoughts on this, Cam, as well as Carl, if you have any thoughts. Simon was wondering about using that kind of less productive land, I suppose, and does the use of that type of land create challenges for some species? Wondering around if other species are getting, what we think of as the worst land, that less productive country, what sort of ecological consequences might be linked with that?
I mean, honestly, Chris, you might be better off answering this one than me. Yeah, it's a huge problem that, a lot of the time we don't even know what those more productive lands would have really looked like, because they were the first things to be cleared. When Europeans first came to Australia, they were the first thing to go. So there's actually not that many records on what was there, but yes, wildlife has been pushed to the least productive fringes of our landscapes. And that's the thing. A lot of the corridors that we've identified are in the more productive, or not always in the more productive, but they definitely have to pass through the productive land if we want to actually create proper biolinks that will connect these fragmented landscapes. So part of the trick is trying to convince landholders who are obviously farming on the most productive land to give up, whether it be, sort of ephemeral waterways or things like that, fencing things off from livestock. It's a big ask for a lot of these landholders who are really primarily focused on getting through the next season and making sure they're not losing income and livelihood. So yeah, especially as things like drought intensify, it's going to be difficult to convince landholders to do that kind of stuff. But yeah, we're going to have to if we want to stop these species from going extinct.
Awesome. Thanks. I think you pretty well covered it. It's in terms of that productivity and I guess what's left for wildlife. We've got a bit of an issue with that shifting baseline where that highly productive land has been kind of cleared for so long now that we don't necessarily know what was there or how those native ecosystems kind of functioned on that land compared to the less productive land that we see now. So it's a really interesting question, something that I think all these sorts of projects in agricultural landscapes have to be somewhat aware of.
Chris,
Jill?
if I could just add, I mean, that's why I guess the easiest is to focus on the waterways. That typically has really good productive land in the riparian zones, and there's a lot of support and funding available for fencing it off, planting it up, and also it would significantly enhance the real estate value of the land for farmers as well. So, and hence, I guess the easiest place to focus is along the waterways.
Yeah, for sure. Jill was wondering, how do you contact recalcitrant landholders with privacy issues, of course, and things like that?
Yeah, so it is the trick. It is the trick. I mean, Melbourne Water, it's an interesting project because Melbourne Water already knows who all of the landholders are in this landscape. So they have an existing relationship with basically all of them. They have tried to contact basically all of them. So at the moment, we're just focusing on the least recalcitrant landholders and working with them to see what can be done. And then once you've done that, we're moving into the stage where we're trying to do the outreach at things like farmers markets, where you go out and you have the tough conversations or the tricky conversations with the landholders. And maybe in that process you find some more people who might be willing. And then from there, you're doing things like letter drops. But we had a day where Chris was there as well, and Georgia and I, where we were out on a patch of Deep Creek, just talking about the project together, and we're on public land, but a farmer came screaming down in his ute and was pretty worked up and quite upset that we were on that patch of land, even though it was public land. And we had a good chat, and talked it through, and just sort of commiserated about the state of things, and eventually he came around, going from quite aggressive, or quite upset, I should say, to being on board in even the smallest possible way, and even said in that conversation that he'd be more than willing to go out and do some tree planting along his stretch of the creek. And it's a pretty significant stretch of the creek. But a lot of the time, with government agencies, these types of landholders are just considered too high risk to even bother engaging with. But it's very rare that someone like that has complete apathy towards nature. They generally don't. And they may be recalcitrant, but they're generally not wanting to do harm, or to make things worse on their stretch of the creek. They want to make it better. They just might have different ideas about that than you. So you've got to really try and come at it with a sense of understanding about where they're coming from, even if you completely disagree with them. And that's a hard thing to do sometimes, because these people, a lot of the time, they have views that are really difficult to just wear on the chin. But yeah, it's kind of it's about finding that thing that you can agree on. Because if we can't agree on something, then yeah, there's just going to be no progress with these landholders, and they own a huge amount of land. So yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, the other thing that occurs to me is we shouldn't underestimate the power of the kids with their parents and their grandparents. And hence we're really focusing with our junior land care facilitator on schools and school kids. My wife has a lovely story about, she's a wildlife carer, and she used to go to schools with joeys and have the kids cuddle them. And she had one joey whose mother died, a fence hanger caught up in the fence, and explained that to the kids. And a couple of years later, a little girl in the shopping centre grabbed her arm, looked up at her, and said, "My dad fixed the fence, fixed the fences." So that's more of a longer term approach, but certainly we shouldn't underestimate the impact of school kids.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
On that note, I'll come back to a couple of other questions, but I'll skip ahead and get to Emma's question about whether junior land care in schools would be a useful thing to roll out education around biolinks and these sorts of projects.
Yeah, I think you should answer that, Carl. I think it's a great idea, but
well, it's a bit of a Dorothy Dixer, because I've been working with Emma, and we have been, and one of our colleagues from our land care group, Paul Carter, has been actually giving presentations at schools, and he's actually taken a little koala platypus mascot with him, and I've been talking with the kids, and they're fascinated. And we've also had them come to our property, and we talk about biolinks and the importance in the landscapes. So certainly, I mean, I think it's very powerful.
Yeah, agreed. Thanks, Carl. Stephen was wondering about the impact of rabbits on re-veg work in this region, based on their experience in the northwestern port area, and having to obviously factor in guarding to project budgets and things like that.
Well, at this stage, we've only worked with a handful of landholders. I think rabbits have been an issue on some of the re-veg jobs in the past, Carl. I'm not sure, you've probably got more experience with that. Are you unmuted?
Sorry, can you rephrase the question, Cam?
So how much of a problem with rabbits have land carers had in the region? Is there much, impact on re-veg?
Not really. The biggest issue we've got is kangaroo and particularly wallaby browsing. So typically we'll need quite high fence guards for the trees where we're close to sort of native veg or have native veg on the property. Kangaroo rabbits will just put, I guess we guard every tree with at least sort of I guess a 30 centimeter guard, or every tree and shrub.
Yeah.
Cool, thanks. Michelle was wondering about, you mentioned using windbreaks, and I guess, Cam, if you have, certain recommendations around using native trees, I guess, as opposed to, a lot of pines and things like that that have been used previously. So, those areas can be acting as corridors for birds and other animals.
I mean, if you're going to be planting a windbreak for the sake of a windbreak, you're better off planting native vegetation um, than you are things like pines. You know, they've done studies where they throw a big tent over a pine tree or an oak tree or something non-indigenous, and they fumigate it and see how many insects fall off it. You know, a big mature introduced tree, they fumigate it and they catch all of the insects that die at the bottom, and they count every species, and the diversity and the abundance is just completely nothing compared to if you were to do the same thing to a mature eucalyptus. So my advice would be to sort of you know do it in a staged way. Don't just plant a fruit salad of things all at once. Plan it out, try and get a succession of different species coming through any kind of windrow that you plant. That your acacias are going to start dying off after X number of years, and then that's going to be followed up by eucalyptus trees. Get the spacing right so you don't just have this big thicket of all of these different trees coming up, and it might be an effective windbreak, but will it be an effective biodiversity corridor? Yeah, it's a different outcome you're trying to achieve, but still better than planting pine trees, that's for sure.
Thanks, Cam. Jerry had a question about the core areas and the connectivity modelling, and whether they're assumed or predicted based on species presence, and how you could apply this sort of model to species or taxa with a low number of records. So I guess I can,
that, Chris.
yeah, I ran that core modelling component, and they're based on the presence of the species preferred habitat effectively. So for koalas and phascogales, that was native woodland, and then they were scaled based on a habitat condition spatial layer, which the CSIRO produce and update semi-regularly. So we looked at using species distribution models, which are based on actual records and things like that, but they can just be a little bit, using them at this small scale can be really throw out some pretty strange results, and also, you might be relying on a really small number of records. So I guess my answer would be, if you know a little bit about the species ecology and the types of habitats they need, you can produce these core patches without having a great number of actual records. But obviously, they're only, these core patches are only relevant if you know that species actually does occur in that region as well. But yeah, you definitely can if you know a bit about where they like to hang out. Cam, did you want to add anything to that one, or?
No, not really. No, I think you nailed it.
Yeah. Well, in that case, unless anyone gets in a very quick last question in the chat, we might leave it there for the night. I want to thank you, Cam, and thanks, Carl, again for presenting tonight. Thanks to everyone who's tuned in and asked questions and joined in the discussion. Feel free to sign up to our mailing list. There's a link to that in the chat to keep up to date with this project, as well as everything else we're working on. And stay tuned for our next webinar next month, which will also be a part of our AGM. So very much looking forward to that. So thanks again, Cam and Carl, and good night, everybody.
Good night.